we're talking politics, which we love to do. Now, something I've been thinking of, last week you mentioned political literacy.
Yes.
So I thought, could we talk about this a little bit more, and could you explain what that term actually means?
Well, yes, certainly, Sarah. It's really a slightly upmarket way of sort of saying, well, what do you know about politics?
Yeah.
Not so much that who does what, who's Prime Minister and stuff. That's part of a broader political knowledge, but more how does the system work? What's the nature of the Australian political system? What are the key aspects of it? So basically it's having a reasonable degree of fluency in understanding how our political system works.
Okay, so that's basically the definition of political literacy.
Broadly speaking,
how
yes.
well you know the system, the ins and outs, and I guess the layers that come with that as well. So overall levels of political literacy in Australia, what would you say there?
Moderate, depending on where in the country, depending on to some extent levels of education, although I would qualify that, and I'll speak to that in a few minutes. But basically, the school children get a little bit of civics education, political knowledge education through their schooling. I think it's about between 15 and 30 hours in a year, and years 6 and 10s are tested on that knowledge. And I saw some stats for Queensland, for example, which were pretty typical of Australia-wide, that about 50% were at a sort of moderate to low level of political knowledge, and maybe that was of year 6s, and then year 10s it dropped to the high 40s.
So do you think that's because the curriculum doesn't support political teachings, or more an interest factor for people of that age group?
I think it's more a case that the curriculum is crowded, and while school children pick up aspects of political knowledge through other subjects, through embedded knowledge, they struggle to sort of focus on political knowledge. It's not, as I said, unrelated to levels of education, but it doesn't necessarily follow that if you have a university education, you necessarily have high levels of political knowledge, although there is a broad correlation between levels of schooling where when you left school as to the level of political knowledge that you have.
So there's a relationship there, the higher education, potentially the higher level of political understanding you have.
Yes, but it's not a sort of necessarily direct and causal type relationship. There are plenty of people I know at the university level. In fact, colleagues and I were discussing a number of things about how we might do a particular piece of research around nicknames and political knowledge. And we talked through a number of questions that we would include in the survey research to ask respondents. And when I tabled a few basic questions, both my colleagues said, wow, I wouldn't have known the answer to half of these.
Yeah, okay.
And these were not trick questions, and they weren't dependent upon having an innate knowledge. So, for example, a question like the Constitution can only be changed by the High Court, true or false?
I'd go true.
False.
Well, there you go. I'm failing.
So, or for example, the Senate is elected by members of the Senate are elected by proportional representation. True or false?
False.
True. Now, these are not overly complicated questions, but they are sort of basic to how our system works. For one final question.
Here we go.
The Prime Minister
Scott Morrison, I've got that.
Well, it doesn't have to be Scott Morrison. The leader, no, let me put it this way. The government is formed in the House of Representatives, true or false?
True.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It's the People's House, the lower house, which provides the basis upon which a government is formed, and the party or parties that join together and have the majority in the House can form a government.
So, Jim, why is it so important that Australians need a sound political literacy or knowledge?
Well, given that we vote, and we're one of the few countries in the world with compulsory voting, and we enforce it, and that probably separates us from a number of countries that have compulsory voting. But by and large, we're quite complacent and happy with compulsory voting. But the fact that everybody votes means that there needs to be some basic level of understanding of how the system works, and of, to some extent, how the political parties get people into, nominate people and that sort of thing, and some broader understanding of what the parties might stand for and what they can and can't do when they're in Parliament. It's
an interesting one, Jim. We're running out of time, but I know a lot of people sort of said we were so involved with American politics that some of us knew it better than our own recently.
Unfortunately, I suppose that's a common truism. We probably know more about what happens in the US at the big picture level than we do at the big picture level in our own country.
2NURFM